So, I'm sorry I couldn't be of any help. I'll let you know if I find out anything,"
said Dalen. The plump and dark-skinned king of Lemuraria had a humble and gentle demeanor, in stark contrast to Gion. Martis reported the whole story, and although it is unclear whether Almayan or Chris visited Oceanus, he promised to investigate and let them know as soon as he found out. He also said he didn't know if his son, Glenn, was involved in the case. Judging from Dalen's behavior, he didn't seem to be hiding anything. As the group left the glittering room adorned with jewel-like, shimmering seashells and made their way toward the palace exit, Elandra suddenly came to a halt. "Hey, what's wrong?" Clare turned around and Elandra looked at Martis.
"She's here."
"What?" Martis asked, but Elandra stopped him and closed her eyes to concentrate.
"Let's go back."
When Elandra opened her eyes, turned on her heels and returned to the throne room, the guide who had been leading the way hurried back, but before he could stop her, Elandra opened the door. Dalen, still sitting on his throne, opened his eyes wide in shock. Then he asked what was going on.
"There's a dungeon in this palace, right?"
Although confused by Elandra's sudden question, Dalen nodded and said, "Yes." When the underwater city was still a nascent civilization, it was certainly used to imprison those who were disrespectful. But it has been out of use for quite some time now.
"What about that?"
Dalen asked, wondering if the existence of the prison would be problem to the underground city.
"That's where Almayan is locked up."
"No way."
Dalen opened his round eyes wide in panic and raised his hips. In that brief unguarded moment, Elandra slipped into the gap in his heart and read Dalen's thoughts. However, as Almayan had conveyed through a vague thought, it seemed certain that Dalen had no involvement in this matter.
"Could you show us around?"
Elandra said with a gentle demeanor, but the aura that emanated from her dignified presence left no room for argument. Dalen hurriedly stood up, said, "Sure," and bowed his head as if to shrink his large body. The space that suddenly appeared before Chris was a large, square room with an endless ceiling. There were entrances to passageways on all four walls, and a shining golden pedestal in the center of the room. A round black stone is placed on the pedestal. The stone, about the size of a volleyball, glowed blue depending on the light. Glenn, coming from the opposite corridor, exclaimed in admiration as soon as he saw the stone. Boralk entered from the left passage, and Dalmia entered from the right passage with their soldiers. Glenn walked around and stood next to Chris.
"This is the water crystal element, Aqua."
Glenn swallowed and stared at the black stone with bloodshot eyes.
"This is the crystal element,"
Boralk muttered, staggering towards the pedestal as if possessed by something. Glenn yelled at Boralk as he reached out to touch the stone.
"No, don't touch it."
Boralk trembled and quickly pulled his hand away. Boralk turned to look at him, and Glenn shook his head.
"It is a crystal element that contains the life energy of the water super dragon, Oralgan. Those who are not the chosen ones must not carelessly touch it before the seal is broken."
Boralk apologized and shrugged his head as he came around behind Chris.
"Well then, Chris, may I ask you a favor?"
Glenn asked, turning his head while still staring at the crystal element.
"Well, what do you want me to do?"
"I want you to break the seal."
Glenn said, excited and impatient. But Chris had no idea what to do. The only thing Martis taught him was Cantermal, which activates Rebellipiece. He wasn't taught how to break the seal. As Chris stood there, confused by Glenn's glaring eyes, a familiar hoarse voice suddenly rang out.
"So that's the water crystal element, right?"
Everyone there turned around. A large man leading a group of soldiers entered the passageway Chris had just come from. It was Gion.
"Your Majesty, Gion."
Glenn couldn't hide his shock when he saw Gion and stood frozen for a moment with his mouth open. Soldiers continued to come in from other passages. Among them is Enebos. The walls of the room were covered with Atli's soldiers.
Why?
Glenn muttered, as if asking himself.
How did we know this place?
Gion said with a grin.
Ramnus.
Gion shouted, and a soldier who had been traveling with Glenn ran over to Gion. The soldier stood next to Gion and turned around.
You?
Glenn stared at the soldier in disbelief. The soldier called Ramnus remained motionless, his expression unchanged, facing forward.
The time has finally come.
As Gion and Glenn glared at each other, Enebos suddenly shouted and ran off. Then he grabbed Aqua from the pedestal and raised it above his head.
With this, I can reign supreme over the sea.
Enebos shouted loudly, but his body began to melt in an instant.
Huh?
It was the last word he said, and Enebos's figure completely vanished, the crystal element tumbling to the ground.
You idiot, get greedy.
Gion said, clicking his tongue as he stared at the rolling crystal element. Then, he raised his head again and glared at Glenn.
Where's Almine?
Hearing Gion's words, Chris became suspicious. Glenn said that Almayan had returned home because Gion had called him back. Chris' doubts about Glenn began to arise again. And that's when he gave Glenn a suspicious look. Suddenly, he was grabbed by the collar and pulled by force. Before he could resist, Chris was being strangled in Glenn's arms. Glenn snatched the torch from Eugilus and pointed the tip at Chris' face. At some point, the torch had turned into a weapon with a sharp, spear-like tip.
I don't know where she is. Hasn't she returned to Atlia's? More importantly, what are you planning to do? Even if you bring so many soldiers, you won't be able to get Aqua if there is no chosen one, you know.
Hearing Glenn's words, Gion was furious.
You've been tempting my daughter since the beginning with the intention of using her, haven't you? Well, isn't it the same for both of me and her? In the first place, she was the one who approached me.
Glenn's grip on him intensified, and Chris' face twisted in pain. Boralk stood nearby in shock and amazement.
What are you going to do with it?
Gion asked, pointing to the crystal element with his chin.
Are you planning to become the Lord of the Sea?
Glenn laughed mockingly.
I'm not interested in such small things.
Glenn continued after a short pause.
Very well, since this would be the last time, I will tell you. I have decided to leave this earth together with the Dark Force, Zalnaban. And with that, the earth will be destroyed. That is my purpose in obtaining the crystal element. What?
Gion was speechless.
Why?
Shouted Boralk from the side.
You said we were going to make Earth a better place, that you'd give it everything you've got, so you asked us to follow you. But you're seriously saying you want to destroy this Earth? What should we do, those of us who believed in you?
Boralk pleaded, clenching his fist and raising his voice. In response, Glenn snorted and quietly replied.
What you do is up to you. I'm only following my own beliefs. The forces of light are also trying to drive out the darkness. When the earth ascends, our dark brethren will be wiped out. Which is good and which is evil is a matter of belief. The ideology of the forces of darkness matches my beliefs, so I have simply chosen them. How about you, Borel? Won't you come with me? Instead of living in the limited world of this small planet, don't you want to try putting your entire existence into motion on the stage of the universe?
Boralk glared at Glenn with trembling fists. And Glenn said, well, never mind, and dragged Chris over to where the Aqua had fallen.
So, what are you going to do?
Gion asked Glenn, who had stopped in front of Aqua. Gion had regained his composure.
Without that boy, even you wouldn't be able to break Aqua's seal. In other words, even if you take him hostage, you won't kill him. Do you really think so?
Saying this, Glenn pointed the tip of the weapon he was holding at Chris' temple.
Once we can find out the location, breaking the seal will be a piece of cake. For the one who has made a pact with the dragon. Even if I kill him, I can just arrange for someone else to do it.
I see. That's good to hear.
Said Gion, grinning.
In that case, we wouldn't care if the boy was killed. Do as you like. And look at these numbers. We clearly have the advantage.
Gion raised his hands and pointed to the soldiers surrounding him. He then took a step back, and the soldiers stepped forward with their weapons at the ready.
Charge!
Gion shouted, and the soldiers came charging in from all sides. Glenn pushed Chris towards the attacking soldiers.
Chris.
Boralk caught Chris as he was about to fall. Behind him was a soldier brandishing a sword.
Watch out.
Chris yelled, but it was too late. The soldier's sword flashed. Barak's face contorted in pain. As Boralk collapsed, Chris held him up. Boralk was convulsing in Chris' arms.
Boralk.
Chris hugged Boralk and shouted with all his might.
Chris. I have admired him, but I seem so stupid.
Boralk laughed softly at the end. Chris held Boralk in his arms and continued to call out his name. Tears flowed endlessly. Then suddenly, Chris felt a shock on the back of his head. Chris collapsed to the ground, still holding Boralk. Blue liquid was spreading on the ground. It was Barak's blood. The blood of underwater dweller is blue. As his consciousness faded, Chris vaguely pondered these things.